Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It is a pleasure to see so many of you here. My name is David Saunders. I'm an associate curator here at the Getty Villa and co-curator of the exhibition Picture Worlds, Greek, Maya and Moche Pottery, which provides the backdrop to this event. I'm delighted to see so many of you here in person. Likewise to those of you watching on Zoom. Good afternoon, hello. And it is a pleasure to welcome you all here to today's lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land Getty inhabits today was once known as Tovangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people, as well as all First People, past, present and future, and honour their labour as original caretakers of this land. Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabrielino Tongva community, and we invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us in caring for it on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples with honour and respect for the deep history of this region. We are delighted to welcome Oswaldo Chinchilla Mazariegos for today's lecture. As I mentioned, this talk complements the exhibition Picture Worlds, which I hope you have seen, or if you haven't, you will have the opportunity after the talk or on subsequent visits. One of the key components of that exhibition are Maya vessels made for cacao. And so this topic felt very, very pertinent, and there is no better person to speak on the matter than Oswaldo. Oswaldo Chinchilla Mazariegos is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Yale University. His research interests encompass art, religion, writing, and the urbanism of ancient Mesoamerica, particularly on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. Oswaldo has published extensively on Maya myth, iconography, and writing, and in particular his book, Art and Myth of the Ancient Maya, was a really valuable guide and resource as we were developing the Picture Worlds project. He was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship for his archaeological fieldwork at the site of Cotzumalhuapa in southern Guatemala, a site with one of the earliest known Mesoamerican inscriptions and known for its fantastic monumental sculptures. Recently, he co-curated the phenomenal exhibition Lives of the Gods, Divinity in Maya Art, and co-curated the catalogue at the Metropolitan Museum and then at the Kimball in Fort Worth. And as I mentioned, in the course of developing our exhibition, Oswaldo has been a key aid, advisor, and inspiration as we developed our project and pursued loans for the show. He also contributed to our publication, which you can buy in the shop. With that, I invite you to join me in welcoming Oswaldo here this afternoon to talk about food for the gods, cacao, and the ancient Maya. Oswaldo.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. David, I was very pleased to be able to collaborate with the exhibition, with you and Megan in every aspect. And then I'm very pleased to be here and be able to share with you some thoughts about the topic that has been of a lot of interest to me. But when I was organizing my slides and trying to put together the presentation, I was thinking, how do I relate it with the topic of chocolate, with the topic of the exhibition, but not just with the Maya, but with other, the comparative purview of the exhibition. And then I thought, well, this is all about vessels that were used, many of them for drinking. And so there's something that they have in common. For the Greek, we were able to explore these magnificent representations of the symposium and the ancient Greeks drinking wine from the very vessels that we see in the exhibition. And then for the Maya, we also see representations. The vessels are sometimes self-referential, right? They have representations of people holding vessels, which should be full of something. And sometimes in archaeology, we forget about that. We find only the vessels. The contents have decayed long ago. But what's important was really the content. We were just looking at one very large amphora, or please correct me if I'm wrong about the shape, David, but that was intended to contain olive oil, Athenian olive oil, and that's what was valuable. That's what was important about it, not the vessel itself. So that was very interesting. And for the moche, well, never mind that the characters over there holding cups are supposed to be drinking blood. But as we shall see, maybe that's not all that different from what we find in Maya concepts about chocolate, and we will get there soon. So in the exhibition, there are very interesting vessels that have inscriptions that describe the function of these vessels. The hieroglyphs that we see, especially around the rim of the vessels, are not about the figures that are portrayed on the vessels, but about the ownership of the vessel, who owned it. And they say phrases like this: he's drinking vessel for tzite cacao, so some kind of cacao. And the one that I am circling there is the glyph for cacao, which looks like a fish. And perhaps it's more clear in this one, which this is not in the exhibition, but this one says he's drinking vessel for ishinte cacao. So another kind of cacao, perhaps referring to forms of preparing cacao, some of the other ingredients that they mixed up with the cacao. And we know that they used, in ancient Mesoamerica, they used a variety of different ingredients, and not necessarily the ones that we would think of traditionally. So generally, these drinks were not sweet, but very bitter. And they were mixed with flowers, with vanilla in some cases, with chilies. And what we know is that the Spanish, when they first arrived to the New World and tried them, really didn't like them. So it took some time before they started sweetening them and making them more palatable to their taste. Here's another example of a vessel that has the same kind of inscription describing the vessel as a drinking vessel, yuk-ib, an object that's made for drinking, and specifically for drinking cacao. And perhaps in this one, it's easier to see the shape of the little fish-like hieroglyph that designates the cacao. But in fact, it has nothing to do with fish. The fish sign that we see there is really the syllable ka. So in the glyph that's drawn to the right, we see the fish with two dots, which means you have to duplicate it. And so you need to say ka plus the syllable wa that's written below, and that would make the word for cacao. There's another form of writing it, which is just by writing, instead of a full fish, just a fin. So the two comb-like signs that you see to the left on this side are the same thing as writing the entire fish, but you're only writing the fish fin. With the same value of ka, so we get ka, and wa, cacao. This is the workings of the Maya hieroglyphic writing system. And we get other details about ways in which they related to cacao and the significance of cacao, especially as related to Maya religion and the gods. For example, in this section from the Dresden Codex, they tell us that specific gods, in this case, in one case, Chak, the god of storms and rain, comes with a vessel full of cacao seeds. And the inscription says, Ochi u cacao. So he enters, perhaps, his cacao, he brings it, perhaps in the sense, and there's also an omen, which is very positive. This is abundance. That's sort of what it says. But not necessarily, because the other deity that's coming with a vessel with cacao pods, the omen is not necessarily very good. Perhaps you can see the guy with with a folded hand. This is the bad omen that it brings. Anyway, so cacao had a lot of significance for ancient Mesoamerican peoples. Here's another fragment from another passage from the Madrid Codex, one of the few, these are some of the few books that are still preserved from the Maya. And in this case, it's two deities, Chac and a female goddess, who are joining their cacao. And that's what the inscription says, actually, Nubi u cacao. They join their cacao. But when we look at the dictionaries, the phrase nuhbi in Chorti, in one of the more about 30 Maya languages that are still spoken today, that phrase nuhbi means to get married. So joining their cacao means getting married, which is pretty cool. Still, until the present, cacao is something that people drink on festive occasions. It's for a wedding, for a celebration, you probably want to offer your guests a cacao drink. And in this case, in this photograph, we're looking at women from the town of Rabinal in Guatemala who are pouring atole from maize, made from maize. That's the white drink that's in the jars, but also cacao in the smaller jar. And the traditional way of drinking cacao, we see all these ceramic vessels, and certainly they were used for drinking cacao. But the more traditional way of drinking cacao until the present is in gourds, in gourd vessels such as the ones that we're looking at here. These are old ones. These are these are two vessels that we actually presented in an exhibition that I curated at the Museo Popol Vuh in Guatemala City years ago. And that's how I started also getting involved with the topic of cacao, and part of what I am presenting here comes from there. So, what is cacao? In the first place, it's a plant, and not all of us may be familiar with the plant. It's a very special tree. One interesting thing is that the pods, the fruits, grow from the trunk of the tree, not from the end of the branches. So you can see the flowers, just the beautiful little flowers growing from the trunk of the tree, and then a full cacao pod in this case. And notice the way that the pod has striations, because that's something that pre-Columbian artists focused on when portraying cacao. And also the elongated shape of the fruit as well. When you open this, there's the seeds inside, but they are covered with a white meat that's kind of juicy. It's sweet. You can make drinks out of that as well, just by mixing it with water. But the way they processed it was by fermenting that the seeds together with the white meat, and that's an important stage in getting the right flavor that you need for cacao, for chocolate drinks, or whatever, you can make it with chocolate. So after you ferment it, you need to dry it, you need to peel the membrane that's adhered to the seeds. Then you have to dry it again, you have to toast it. And that's a whole process that was developed early on in Mesoamerica, thousands of years ago. And we don't know a lot of details about how that happened. One thing that we're learning more and more is that cacao didn't really originate in Mesoamerica. For those of you who are unfamiliar, when I talk about Mesoamerica, this is much of Mexico and northern Central America. But cacao really originated in the Amazon, the Amazonian region, because that's the region where we find the largest variety of wild species. And very recently, they have reported archaeological remains of cacao at this place, Santana La Florida, in Ecuador, dating 5,300 years before present. So at that time, people were using cacao and were consuming cacao in Ecuador. And a process, we don't know about exactly how they were processing it, whether they already were doing all this processing involving the fermentation and toasting and all of that. In any case, it seems that cacao came to Mesoamerica carried by people who were already using it in this region. And notice that there's also a large variety of species in places in Central America. So I think we still need to learn much more about the origins of cacao, how it was domesticated, and how it came to Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador. The earliest remains that we know come from Paso de la Amada, a site that's located down here. It's shown in this map in the Pacific coast of southern Mexico. And the remains that we have are not actual cacao because it doesn't preserve well. In Mesoamerica, the weather really doesn't favor preservation of organic materials. And so what archaeologists have done is scrape the walls of ceramic vessels or sherds, as small as this sherd that we see here, from Paso de la Amada, and then do chemical analysis to see if there are remains of substances that will be distinctive of different plants. And in this case, they found the remains of theobromine and caffeine. And those are the two alkaloids that are present in cacao and that basically are used to establish that at some point, at least, a vessel like this, which would be the whole vessel, contained cacao, contained something made out of cacao. There are also figurines that have what I believe to be cacao pods growing from their bodies, and that could be also an indication. And keep this in mind because we will see others later on. In Mesoamerica, cacao was something that's not just something that you consumed, but it was wealth. It was one of the more valuable substances that were traded, that were produced and traded, and sometimes they tell us that it was really a luxury substance that was reserved for consumption by noble people. And that's probably true, especially for regions where it was not produced. It could only be produced in certain regions that had the adequate climate, the adequate conditions of rainfall, and so in places where you had to import it, it was very expensive. And when I say that, you should think that people were carrying it in their backs because there were no animals, not pack animals that could carry it for them. So we get, for example, for the Aztec, and here we're jumping until the 16th century, right after the Spanish conquest of Mexico, where we have this kind of documentation about the tribute that different provinces paid to the Aztec. And this is the tribute page for the province of Soconusco, where the same region where that site Paso de la Amada is located, and it included a lot of cacao. So here we have a bundle that each of these flags is equivalent to the number 20, and so this would be 100 loads of cacao. And there's another 100, right? That the people of Soconusco would be paying to the Aztec every year. So that's a substantial amount of cacao. They had special measurements, the special ways of measuring of counting cacao, because what they did is count the seeds, right? So 400 cacao seeds would be one sontle, 20 sontles would be one chiquipil, and 3 chiquipils would be one carga. They use that Spanish word. So that's 24,000 seeds that would be inside one of these bundles. And that's some amount of cacao. Now, that's a tribute of Soconusco, and in this map you can see how this was one of the most important producing regions in the 16th century. And not only Soconusco, but the entire Pacific coastal Piedmont of Guatemala and El Salvador were also, it was like a corridor where there was a lot of cacao production. Also, Tabasco, the Ulua Valley, and other regions produced important amounts of cacao. The Maya lowlands, the vessels that we saw before actually originate from the Maya lowlands over here, and we don't see a lot of cacao production there. It may be that we're missing a little bit of that because part of this region was depopulated in the 16th century, was not very, very thickly inhabited. But I will be speaking in this talk about the lowlands, so I want to locate them here, and the Pacific coast, which is down here, the Pacific coast of all the way from southern Mexico to El Salvador. In that region, we have some of the rare remains of archaeological remains of cacao coming from archaeological research. So my professor, Frederick Beauvais, digging at the site of Valberta in the 1980s, found this, large vessels that were deposited in, they're buried intentionally, and when they lifted them up, they found inside what looked like cacao seeds. And so Fred was tremendously excited. He was like, oh, this is the greatest find that anyone has done. And but then he was very disappointed to learn that they were not actually cacao, but clay imitations of cacao seeds. I remember him writing back and forth to the lab and asking, are you sure about this? But actually, for the Aztec in the 16th century, they tell us that cacao was so valuable that they counterfeited it. And so it may be that these vessels were actually full of cacao seeds, and they also included a few counterfeits, right? In any case, here are the clay cacao seeds and the actual cacao seeds they're perfectly comparable. And this is from around 300 in our era, the year 300 in the current era. From the 16th century, we also have written testimonies by both indigenous and Spanish authors. And this is one from Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, who was named as the royal chronicler of the Indies in the early 16th century by the Spanish king. And he tells us this: a rabbit is worth 10 of these almonds. The seeds they're being called almonds. And for 4 almonds, they give 5 of that excellent fruit that they call mononsapot. And a slave is worth more or less 100 of these almonds. So cacao was used as currency, and they used it to buy and sell other kinds of things. And actually, one Spanish commentator, Peter Martyr, called it admirable gold. Why? Because it could not be hoarded, right? Because it would decay, you would need to consume it. So this is like gold, the best kind of gold, because no one can keep it permanently, right? This was one of the, actually not Spanish, but Italian humanists who working for the King of Spain. Now, cacao could be consumed in different ways, and there's a question of whether the ancient Maya consumed it in sort of together with solid foods, like a mole, right? Like a sauce, like a mole, like a thick sauce that are still, and there's no reason to think why not, but actually there's very little archaeological evidence. In Copan, they have found vessels that contain remains of animals together with remains of cacao, with the chemical signatures of cacao. So it's possible that was a kind of mole. But most of the evidence that we have is about drinks. And here I have a panel from the site of Piedras Negras in Guatemala that tells us about how the king of the city of Yaxchilán went to visit the king of Piedras Negras, and then at dusk they drank cacao. They danced. Actually, they tell us that they danced and then they drank cacao. There's a little bit of discussion about the correct interpretation of this, but it appears that they may have consumed also some alcoholic form of cacao, which is strange. Cacao is not really something that you ferment for alcoholic beverages, but it may be that they were mixing it with some alcoholic substance, and I hope you can see the little fish over here for the word cacao. And as I'm telling you, it was an item of wealth. It really symbolized abundance of all kinds. And in these painted stones, we see deities, an important deity, Awil, who is carrying bags full of cacao. And this actually tells us the number of cacao seeds again. And in this case, it would be 9 pig, so 9 times 8,000. A lot of cacao. So this is just about wealth, abundance, and the propitiation of all kinds of wealth. Here, that same deity is depicted bringing a plate full of ear spools. So these would be jewels, right? Ear spools, the kinds of things that you put on, which were probably made of jade. So that's wealth. And together with it, there's cacao. There's cacao pods that are hanging here and there, and other things that are all related to bountiful, wealthy, abundant things. There's an interesting comparison and perhaps a contrast with maize. So the staple, cacao was not the staple. No one could survive by just eating chocolate, right? Or at least, I don't know. I guess there are some who try. But the food for Mesoamerican peoples was maize, corn. And that was very deeply embedded in their religious and lifeways in every way. So here we have representations of gods, of the same god, basically a young, very handsome god who we know as the god of maize, the maize god, carrying corn cobs, right? And then in another figurine from the same region, these are clay figurines, we have the same character, this young god who is always dancing, right? He's always look at the way his leg is lifted, like in a dancing pose. But here there are cacao pods that seem to be growing, perhaps from his belt or perhaps from his own body. So the maize god for the Maya also personified cacao. There's a logic to that. There's again, the idea of bounty and of abundance. But as I'm telling you, it's also an interesting contrast because maize and cacao are different kinds of plants. Maize grows under the sun, while cacao grows in the shadow. You plant trees, you plant shadow trees over the cacao trees, and that's an important thing that planters do to create the good, the right microenvironment for the cacao. And the pollinators need this to thrive. Cacao grows only in very hot places, only in lowland places with a lot of humidity. Maize can grow with humidity, but maybe not. It's not the best for it. It grows in drier regions. And again, so there's an interesting contrast that perhaps we will also encounter later on. I already mentioned this, how we have an idea of what were the best producing regions in the 16th century at least, and that's because we have the listings of tributes, how much cacao did different towns in places in like Guatemala and El Salvador paid to the Spanish authorities after, during the colonial period. And you can see in this map, these very large circles correspond to the amount of cacao that was paid by places in El Salvador, for example, in the region of the Izalcos in El Salvador, it was huge. And then in places across Guatemala and here in the southwestern part, that was where the biggest production was concentrated. And this map doesn't really include the Soconusco, which was the other very important cacao producing region. So that is why it is not surprising that in this region we also have a wealth of representations of cacao that we will examine now. For example, and this is where Bové found those fake cacao seeds at Valberta, more or less over here, so the same region. But we have a lot of wealth of representations. Here I'm comparing a page from the Dresden Codex, which is not from this region, but shows a deity carrying cacao pods. The maize god, the same young guy that we saw before, carrying cacao pods in a vessel. But in the Pacific coast, what we get is this. This is the lid of a censer that shows a character who's carrying a vessel with cacao pods. But this seems to be a female, right? She has breasts, and there are cacao seeds all over the entire lid. So here's another contrast between maize and cacao. So the maize gods are male, while at least in the Pacific coast, cacao gods are very often female, cacao goddesses. In this region, they very often molded, took cacao pods and applied clay on them, molded, made representations that were actually molded on real cacao pods. And this is what we see here, a vessel that's created from an actual cacao pod. And they also, made similar shapes without molding them from the actual pod. But here we have another censer lid with a very similar image of a goddess, and in this case it's not very distinctive, but I believe it's female carrying a cacao pod that's probably also molded from an actual cacao pod. She doesn't have really, the breasts are not really obvious here, but notice that she has the same kind of ornaments in the shoulders, like this, or perhaps scarifications in this case. And we get this. We get personifications of the cacao tree. Remember how the pods in the cacao tree grow from the trunk of the tree. It seems that here they're personifying the vessel as a human being, and especially a female goddess, I would think, because it has tiny breasts. Actually, the cacao pods themselves look like breasts. There are multiple breasts that are growing from the body of these goddesses. They also have these very distinctive marks on the cheeks. See, we will find them again. Now, this is one of the objects that we exhibited in that exhibition that I am telling you from the Museo Popol Vuh collection, and I was very surprised to find it again in Netflix. Some of you may have watched this Netflix series about Louis XIV, the King of France, and here's the cacao goddess in Versailles. Which is very unlikely. Certainly they didn't know much, but it is true that cacao became fashionable in Europe, beginning perhaps in the 17th and 16th and 18th century for sure. There were chocolate houses in many places in Europe. And what's interesting is they adopted the same technology that they did in the Mesoamerican technology for processing cacao was the same that they used in Europe. They, some of you may be familiar with Mesoamerican grinding stones, where, grinding stone where a woman, generally a woman, uses a stone pestle horizontally to grind the stone. They use the same thing in these chocolate houses in Europe. And I should have put a photograph of that here. Another representation of the same kind, in this case, an old individual. I'm asking the question of whether this is a goddess, this is a female, just because the others are female as well, right? But in this case, it's interesting that she's aged, and you can see all the little cacao pods growing from her body. And this is what I showed you, going back to perhaps to the early formative period at Paso de la Mada, with that drawing of a figurine with cacao pods growing from her body, from her or his body. Here's another fascinating representation of cacao from the same region of Escuintla in Pacific Guatemala. The cacao pods are molded on real cacao pods, but it looks like a cacao pod has opened, and there's a character that's emerging from it, and it's a butterfly. It's a butterfly. You can see the wings here, and other attributes of butterflies in the Teotihuacan style. Teotihuacan is this great city in the highlands of Mexico, which became very dominant during the early centuries of the current era across Mesoamerica. And Teotihuacan was expansive, and there's a lot of debate about whether the Teotihuacanos created an empire, like the Aztec did centuries later. But in any case, they were coming to the Pacific coast, and we have all this wealth of representations in the Teotihuacan style coming from this region, very likely related to acquiring cacao from this region. And then we get a very interesting group of ceramic figurines that have that show people wearing cacao pods in the neck, like hanging from a collar here, but their hands are tied in the back, so these are captives. These are war captives that for some reason are wearing cacao pods. This figure, we don't really know with a lot of precision the dating of this, but it may be, my guess would be like 500 in the Common Era. And then in the 16th century, so 1,000 years later, we get testimonies, written testimonies that may explain these figurines. This comes from Diego García de Palacio, who wrote about the pipil of El Salvador at that time. And he said this: those who were in the war came orderly, singing and dancing, and they brought those who were to be sacrificed with many feathers and jewels in their feet and hands, with strings of cacao around the neck, and these were brought by the captains in their midst. Captives wearing cacao pods around their neck. The same thing that we saw in that figurine. And then what happened to them? The steward came with a large stone knife in the hand, and he opened the chest and took out the heart. I believe in this figurine there's a strangely shaped incision on the left side of the chest, which I believe may refer to the sacrificial destiny of this war captive. We found one in my own excavations only 2 years ago. We found an example of this, and that was very exciting for me. I was like, Fred, because finally we were able to establish that these figurines with cacao pods around the neck came from this region. And the dating is more or less 400 to 600 Common Era. But we know a group of them that are not provenance, so we don't know exactly where they came from, but surely from this region. Again, captives with their hands tied that are wearing cacao pods around their necks. And these are also whistles. See, they have a place where you can blow and they will sound. And here's another one. What's amazing is the continuity between these figurines that are so ancient and then the 16th century testimony that may explain why they were wearing these cacao pods. But we need to go deeper. And it appears that in Mesoamerica, there was a real analogy. The people made a real analogy between cacao and blood. And it was not only with blood, with other motifs that were related to human sacrifice. So Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo in the 16th century tells us this. To make this drink look like blood, they add a little of that bija, which is achote. Some of you may know achote. Here's a photograph of achote seeds, and when you grind this, you get this paste that is used for coloring food, for making it red or yellow, and it also contributes to the taste. So they added that to make it red, to make it look like blood. This is the testimony of a Spaniard, and we may think it may be prejudiced, perhaps, but not necessarily. We find a lot of representations of cacao related to human sacrifice in ancient art. At Cochumalguapa, in the same region of the Pacific coast, we get this. This is a drawing of a very large sculpture with a terrible scene where a death god is standing and he's holding a human heart, a bleeding heart, in his hand. And he has obviously sacrificed these other characters that are falling with their chest open. Here I added color to this one to show like the wound in the chest and all the cacao pods that are attached to the body of this animal. It's not a person. It's an animal, a composite animal of sorts, jaguar-like, but also with a bifid tongue. According to some, the shape of cacao pods may resemble human hearts. That's perhaps in the eye of the beholder. But we also find a lot of resemblance to human heads. And this is a great sculpture from the same site, Cochumalguapa, in Escuintla, in Guatemala. And here's a drawing for clarity, a very large relief and a very complex relief. And I'm highlighting here a detail that doesn't really have much to do with cacao, but it's the only representation that we have of a puppet in Mesoamerican art. So notice how there's a guy who's handling a puppet while probably dancing. Again, all of this has to do with dancing, singing, and sacrifice. This is the main character, and he's singing. There's something coming out of his mouth, and that's what he's saying, his speech, or more likely, his song. And there's also a skull in his chest. So a death god that's also singing. And see how the song grows and basically encircles the whole scene. And there's a lot of fruit that's attached to it. But the fruits have human faces. And there's also flowers. There's also flowers and birds that are pricking the flowers. And there's also other things like jewels, like an ear spool here, like the ones that we saw before. A lot of different items that relate to natural bounty, beauty, colorful things like birds and flowers, and fruits that include cacao pods, at least one of them. Here we have a very distinctive cacao pod with the striations. But what's happening in the sculpture, this character is also holding a knife that I painted red so that we could make it readable here. And with the knife, he's harvesting the fruit. He's cutting these fruits, and that's like cutting heads, right? One interesting thing is that cacao doesn't fall from the tree. The pods don't fall. You have to harvest them. And to harvest them, you need a knife. And that's one reason for this analogy. But there are surely others. Here's the striated cacao pod that I showed you that definitely looks like a human head. So why all this sacrificial symbolism for cacao? That's what we need to explain. Is there just a physical affinity, like a cacao pod looking like a human heart? Perhaps. I don't think a cacao pod looks like a human head, but it might. And in any case, here cacao pods are also among many other kinds of precious things. And we should think that these sacrifices were made to honor the gods and especially to feed them, right? To feed the gods. And what better to feed them, what better substance to feed them than what's most precious? So cacao, or perhaps blood, perhaps human victims, just as precious. I want to end the talk with a lighter aspect, which is the relationship of cacao with monkeys. And here we have representations of monkeys wearing cacao pods around the neck. So were these monkeys sacrificial victims? Well, they don't have their hands tied. They don't look like captives. They're simply wearing cacao. And this one is fascinating to me because notice how this vessel was, this is a palimpsest. The vessel, this is the rollout photograph of a cylindrical vessel like the ones that we see in the exhibition. But it originally had a black surface, and they painted monkeys, long-tailed monkeys, in yellow. But then they decided to cover the whole design with stucco, with a very fine layer of stucco, and paint over it. And here we can see cacao pods growing from the tails of the monkeys. So there's a definite relationship between cacao and monkeys. Now, monkeys eat cacao. They can eat it. They're a nuisance for planters, definitely. And there's this interesting relationship, between the role that monkeys played in, the natural growth of cacao and the preservation of the plantings for the problems that they presented for planters. In any case, this is something that we need to keep working on. This is something that we don't understand well yet. We need to put together the variety of representations that we have of these monkeys. In this case, one of them with a load in his back, which may be cacao, may contain cacao. Certainly the pods that are hanging from his neck are cacao. So, but at the same time, it may bring them together with the sacrificial victims that we saw in the other figurines. So, with this I will finish, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have, if there's some.
Thank you, Oswaldo, for highlighting the many settings and contexts in which cacao played such an important role in Mesoamerican culture. It also makes me think from a Greek perspective of connections between wine and blood as well, so there's ample material to explore. We have time for questions. There are microphones available on either side of the auditorium. For those of you who are on Zoom, please submit your questions via the Q&A box in the bottom of the screen, and we will try to answer a number of those. If I could ask those in the audience if you could raise your hand if you have a question or query. I can see one on the right, my right, a few rows back.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering if we're going to discuss anything about cacao being used in ceremony.
Well, the vessels that are inscribed with text that indicate that they were for cacao drinks were very likely used in ceremonies. They are very fine vessels, and they were probably employed on feasting occasions where they would be filled with cacao beverages and perhaps shared, because many of them are very large, right? So who knows how much cacao could someone drink? But they were probably shared between the participants in these events. And from ethnographic data, we have, we know that cacao is special, and that drinks made of cacao are an important part of every ceremony.
There's a question right in the middle. Wait for the microphone is coming your way.
I want to add something else. There's a colonial period indications, documentation about, for the Cachiquel in the Guatemalan highlands, there were 2 months, Nabey Toquic and Rucac Toquic, which were the first harvest of cacao and the second harvest of cacao. So during these months, there were feasts that were dedicated definitely to cacao.
In Aztec codexes, when they wanted to depict an enemy as inferior or weak, they would have them holding or pulling their hair and chopping it off. Would that relate to how cacao is harvested?
Yeah, that's what I think. That severing the head of a captive in this case would be analogous to what the cacao harvest represented. So harvesting cacao was like taking captives in this sense, you know.
So another question on the.
I also wanted to thank you for the talk, and you kind of mentioned how valuable cacao seeds were and how they kind of were almost like a currency. And I'm just wondering, you talked about how the Mesoamerican region produced a lot of cacao, but for say there was a year of lower production or a drought or a famine or excess production, would that change the valuation of the currency, or were there issues that were caused by that?
That's very thoughtful, and I would say yes, definitely. You know, when I did this exhibition at the Museo Popol Vuh, there was someone who came and told me, you know what, I'm an economist, and what you're saying there doesn't work, you know, because if you compare the values of different items, it doesn't, they're not proportional, right? And the thing is, we know very little about the way that cacao was valued in this as a medium of exchange. We have testimonies, but they are isolated, like a testimony from Nicaragua in the 1530s, and then another from someplace in Mexico in the 1560s or something like that. So the values may have changed very significantly, and it's hard to tell how they related to each other. But you're right. Definitely, a bad year would raise the value of cacao. And in colonial times, once the colonial system was established and Spanish people also started consuming cacao, the production actually went up. You know, the production in places like Soconusco went up significantly because there was a lot of demand in Mexico City, and there was also ways of transporting it by shipping or by using ox carts or something that were more efficient than whatever was available below. So there were all these variables affecting the value of cacao.
So another question, the right.
Thank you for the presentation. So when the conquistadores, first discovered the cacao, what was the appeal to them to make them want to ship the beans back to Europe? I mean, if the flavor was so, unattractive, why did they bother?
You mean for the Spanish?
Okay, the Spanish.
Yeah, so the flavor was very bitter. They didn't really like it, but they realized that it was a valuable thing for indigenous peoples, and so they took over the production. Spanish landowners and encomenderos and so took over production in places like the Izalcos in El Salvador and also in Soconusco, and they started exporting it in more quantities to Mexico City. So that was an incentive for producing it. Only gradually they started, acquiring a taste for chocolate and especially adding sugar, which made it more palatable, and then it became a fashion both in Mexico, in places in the New World, and then in Spain, it became a real fashion. Yeah, so the other interesting thing is that there was a tremendous discussion in colonial times about whether cacao was food or drink, right? And that's a very important thing. If it was drink, it could be consumed during Lent, But if it was food, it could not, right? And there were treatises. There were people writing treatises about whether it was food or drink, and it was a serious thing. I mean, Thomas Gage, this British English priest who traveled in Mexico and Guatemala in the 17th century, tells us how in Chiapas, women would be hearing mass, and then their servants would come with cacao gourds for them because it was too long. They had to drink their cacao. And then some priest complained. The priest complained, and people drew swords in the church on this matter. That's how important it was.
I think we have both food and drink chocolate afterwards. There's a question towards the back. Yes.
Did the Mayans consider cacao to be have healing properties? As we do know now, it's a good brain food. It's good for the eyes, and it has a depth of healing properties that we're aware of now. And if you go back in time and you recall, I mean, even my mother was born in Merida. When I go there, I hear people even joke about the Mayans having big heads. And it was, that they had great brain power and were able to decipher so many secrets that we wouldn't know today, maybe.
Well, I don't know about the heads, but the cosmetic properties of cacao were certainly known. Cacao butter is such a great cosmetic substance. And Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, who was in Nicaragua very early on, tells us that people would take cacao paste and cover their whole face with cacao paste to protect themselves from the sun, And then they would go to the market, and if they were a little bit hungry, they would just pull a little bit of cacao and eat it. Yeah.
I saw a question at the front here, but maybe, Shelby, do we have anyone on Zoom? Any queries?
We do. A number of people are very interested in cacao as money. And one question is about whether there was commercial as well as other kinds of trade and tribute uses of cacao.
So lately we have been learning more and more about market economies for the Maya. So in the past it appeared that there was no real market exchange, but lately in the last 15 years or so, more and more archaeologists are identifying locations that may have served as markets in archaeological sites in the Maya area, so marketplaces. Also, there are artistic representations of people buying and selling things that, especially at the site of Calakmul in southern Campeche. And so it is possible that it was being traded relatively like as a merchandise. We don't really have many more details about all of that.
A couple of questions.
When it was still the Indio period, how far north have you found evidence of?
Well, interestingly, they have found chemical evidence of the chemical signatures of cacao in vessels from the U.S. Southwest, which is certainly a region where they did not produce it. The climate is just not, it's not possible, so they must have been importing it from places in, perhaps in Veracruz, which would be fairly close, not too close, but closer than the Soconusco.
In Texas, maybe, or New Mexico?
I'm not sure exactly, but I believe it's New Mexico or Arizona, not in Texas. These vessels that I have in mind are not from Texas. There may be vessels in Texas that haven't been tested.
Should we try another one on Zoom?
Questions about the association of women with cacao. For example, the cacao goddess, does she do other things and have other spheres? And also, how frequently are women likely to have been preparing cacao?
Well, women preparing cacao, definitely most of the food preparation in Mesoamerica was done by women, and it still is. So definitely preparing cacao was mostly a female task in any way that it was prepared. Now, whether these cacao goddesses have other connotations, I don't know. We have these representations, we have this wealth of representations, but sometimes they are holding other kinds of things in their hands. Instead of a cacao pod, they are holding a butterfly, or they are holding a bird. And thinking of the analogy with sacrificial victims that cacao pods may have with sacrificial victims, it is possible that these goddesses were related with, sacrificial victims. So perhaps as mediators, taking not just cacao, but the souls of dead warriors, represented as butterflies or birds. That's one way of looking at it.
Is there a question towards the back on the left, on my left? A number of rows up. Sorry, with a cap.
Hi, you mentioned the 18th century European chocolate houses. That's about the time that coffee houses were big in Europe. Did anybody mix chocolate and coffee like I do at home?
I would think that someone did that, but I think that coffee, in a way, supplanted cacao in many contexts in Europe. So the fad for cacao was earlier. Was like 16th century. Not really 16th century. 17th, 18th century. That's the time when cacao was really popular, and eventually other kinds of drinks also made it into the European market, such as tea and coffee. And so don't quote me on this. I may be wrong in the history of consumption in Europe, but that's I believe that.
When I mentioned Bach's Coffee Cantata was written before he died in 1750, so that puts it in the middle of the 18th century. So maybe they coexisted at some point.
Right.
Maybe more research.
I need to hear that cantata.
I'm keeping an eye out on on my watch. We've maybe got time for one question. I think you already have a mic, and then maybe one last off Zoom.
Hi, yeah, my question is about the sacral significance and the preparation of cacao, considering it was so ritualistically important. I was wondering if the Spanish adulteration of the drink, like adding sugar, for example, if the indigenous response to that was recorded. Was it seen as acceptable? Did that trend then carry itself back across the ocean? Did people in Mexico start adding sugar to cacao, or was it purely a European thing?
Well, I can tell you that modernly, Maya people drink cacao very sweet, very, very sweet. So it's not. I don't know the response at the current at that time. It may have been different. I don't think that's recorded anywhere. But eventually, Maya people did acquire the taste for sweets very much.
Shelby, one last off Zoom if we have.
Maya peoples had honey before. Mesoamerican peoples consumed honey and perhaps added it to chocolate-like drinks since pre-Columbian times as well.
Did different kinds of cacao or ways of treating it, as with coffee or wine, exist in a hierarchy of value that we can tell?
I don't think I understand the question.
Were there types or places of growing cacao that we can tell had more power and oomph?
Definitely, there were different qualities of cacao, and in the Maya inscriptions in the vessels, we get all these descriptions of what kind of cacao they are intended for. So, for sure, that was significant. The different either preparations or varieties of cacao were significant. And in terms of quality, we really know more about the colonial period, because there were areas that were definitely more appreciated for the quality of their cacao. And yeah, the Izalcos in El Salvador and was one of them, for example. Yeah, I can think of them. Yeah, I believe that not only I can think of, but they were buying and selling cacao from the Izalcos at higher prices than, say, cacao from somewhere else. I don't want to offend anyone.
That may be a good point to. Thank you so much for all of your questions. This is such a rich topic, and evidently all of your questions highlight